Welcome back to the channel, chess fans. Today, we've got a real gem of a puzzle from the epic 1985 World Chess Championship match between two absolute titans, Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. This match was held in Moscow, and it was a nail-biter. Kasparov, the young challenger representing the winds of change in the Soviet Union, ended up winning 13-11 to become the youngest world champion ever, at just 22 years old. It came right after their controversial 1984 match that got abandoned after 48 games with no winner. Politics were in the air, too. Kasparov was seen as the new Russia guy, aligned with Gorbachev's reforms, while Karpov embodied the old guard. Fun fact, their rivalry spanned 5 world championship matches, and this 1985 clash is where Kasparov first claimed the crown. The position we're looking at today is from one of their games, with white to move and a chance to unleash some fireworks. White's got a bishop staring down the diagonal toward black's king side, a queen on g4 eyeing some lines, rooks on d1 and e1 ready to roll, and a knight on f3. Black's got doubled rooks on the d-file, a queen on f6, and some pieces hanging around, but that king on g8 looks a bit exposed. Let's solve this like pros and break it down for you amateurs out there. I'll show all the key lines on the board. First off, you might look at this and think, hey, white's rook on e1 can slam up the e-file for a check. Something like e8 plus, checking the king. It looks spicy because the rook attacks horizontally across the 8th rank to g8. But black's no slouch. They can just snag it with the rook from d8 to e8. Now white's down a rook for nothing, and the evaluation tips slightly to black. Not ideal. So that's a bust. Why? Because that pesky rook on d8 defends e8 perfectly. We need to deflectionize that defender somehow. Get it out of the way. Enter the bombshell move. White's queen on g4 can slide diagonally to capture black's rook on d7. Boom. That's the queen sacrificing herself on d7, grabbing the rook. Now, black pretty much has to recapture, right? If they ignore it, white's just up a rook with a monster queen on d7, attacking everywhere, like threatening the bishop on b7 or even the knight on c6 indirectly. But let's assume black plays smart and takes back with the rook from d8 to d7. Notice what's happened. The d8 rook has been lured to d7, leaving d8 empty and undefended. Perfect setup. Now white strikes with the rook from e1 to e8, checking the king. This is glorious because now there's no rook on d8 to capture it. Black can't take this rook. Nothing attacks e8 anymore. They can't block on f8 either. No pieces can get there without jumping obstacles, like the queen can't hop over its own pawn on f7. So the only escape is shifting the king to h7. Okay, king sidesteps to h7, but watch this. White's bishop on d5 was blocking its own rook on d1, but now we can move it with tempo. Bishop to e4, checking the king again. This clears the d5 square, opening the d-file like a highway, and the bishop now lasers down the diagonal through f5 and g6 to hit the king on h7. Black's in hot water. They can't capture this bishop on e4. Nothing attacks it. The b7 bishop is blocked by its own knight on c6. So they have to interpose or move the king again. But moving the king leads to disaster. The worst options for black are tossing the queen in the way, like queen to f5 to block. That loses the queen for free to the bishop capturing it, since f5 isn't defended. Or queen to g6, where white's bishop can snatch it. And even if the king recaptures, white's up a queen for a bishop with attacks everywhere. Black's best shot is pushing the pawn from g7 to g6 to block the check. Solid try. But now the d-file is wide open, and white's rook on d1 can finally pounce. Rook captures on d7, taking black's last rook. And here's the beauty. d7 isn't protected by a single black piece. The queen on f6 doesn't attack it, the bishop on b7 can't horizontally, the knight on c6 misses it, and the king is too far. Black can't recapture, so they've lost both rooks while white only gave up the queen. Net gain, and white still has that powerhouse rook on e8 controlling the board, plus the bishop on e4 and knight on f3 ready for more action. Black's position is crumbling. They're down material. The king's exposed on h7, and white can keep pressing, maybe with checks or picking off pawns like on f7 next. Evaluation shows white's up the equivalent of a rook plus here, a clear win with good play. Whew, what a sequence. If black skips, recapturing early or tries other dodges, it only gets worse for them. White just keeps the extra material and piles on the pressure. No wonder this kind of deflection tactic is gold in chess. It turns a blocked position into a rout. I love how the bishop move not only checks, but also unclogs the d-file for the knockout blow. In summary, This puzzle from the Kasparov-Karpov 1985 rivalry showcases white's winning idea. The queen grabs the rook on d7, forcing black's other rook to recapture there. Then the e1 rook checks by going to e8, pushing the king to h7. Next, the bishop shifts to e4 for another check, which black blocks with a pawn advance to g6. Finally, white's d1 rook snaps up the now undefended rook on d7, leaving black rookless and in a hopeless spot. What a masterclass in tactics. Hope you enjoyed. Smash that like button if you did, and drop your thoughts in the comments.